Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura and I'm joined by Jasmin and Emma to talk about research into gut bacteria and how they influence what goes on in your brain, which I think is absolutely amazing. But Jasmin, why does this interest you?
I know that your gut and the brain talk to each other because, obviously you're hungry. Your gut tells your brain to eat something. But I was surprised to learn that the bacteria or your microbiome can also have an impact and also talk to your brain, especially in the area of food addiction.
Yeah, this seems to be some relatively new research that popped up on my news feed. I think it was about last year when there was a bit of a hoo-ha about they'd finally found very convincing evidence that what goes on in your guts can influence how you behave. It's all about this gut-brain connection, which sounds incredibly complicated, and I don't think anyone's gotten to the bottom of it, even though it's been studied for quite a long time. But Emma, I know you work with DNA, so I hope you're going to help us interpret some of the research which seems to look at gene expression.
Yeah, I mean, because my background is basically biophysics, heavy on the physics, recently into the DNA sphere, I've had to kind of learn how to interpret different biology papers, which a lot of the time seem to be so many figures and not much explanation to what's actually happening. So hopefully I can try and explain some things. But what I do know is, because I work with quite a few biologists, is I've had conversations with them about your gut health and how your gut microbiome actually affects your gut health and your overall health. You know, there's loads of studies on how it can kind of prevent certain diseases, and it's something that is kind of getting more popular, I think, in media, of what people want to try and have good gut health. So I feel like I'm not actually surprised that they communicate so much, but I still don't think that scientists, or especially me, understand how that actually happens and how it can kind of affect different cravings that we have. But I believe that it can, because I think there's just so much happening. So, but no reason why.
Because the human body is complicated. Yeah, I think that is definitely so true. And what I find a little bit odd about this is I only heard about the gut-brain connection recently, but it turns out scientists have known about it since around 1998, I think the first study was reported, which is old.
It's older than me. Yeah, and also when you guys were just talking about how it affects your behaviour a lot and food affecting your behaviour, it just reminded me of the Snickers tagline, which is "You're not you when you're hungry." And so I don't know if the gut has something to do with that as well.
When you get hangry.
Yeah. But I guess it would make sense for people that don't know, what do we mean by gut microbiome and gut bacteria. So they are good bacteria. They're basically bacteria that we want, but it's your microbiome is kind of this environment of different organisms as well as bacteria. You might have yeast or viruses, and it's the diversity in that, just like a diversity in farms and this kind of herd immunity aspect of it. You want this high biodiversity for a good gut health. Although, how does a good gut health actually affect our overall health? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, and from what Jasmin and I were reading into when we were looking at this for cows that produce methane, it's really not straightforward. There are so many different things inside the guts of an animal that seem to interact in really complicated ways. So I guess that ties in with what you were saying about having a good biodiversity in there. But the reason I thought this particular study might be a good one to discuss was because it popped on newsfeed, and it was about a specific class of gut bacteria that had been linked to food addiction, as Jasmin mentioned, whereas a different class seemed to prevent food addiction. So it just seems incredible to me that your gut bacteria could influence how you behave, and particularly how addicted you get to something. I think I shared this study with you guys, didn't you? Did you have a chance to read it?
Yeah. The way that they find the correlation is a mixture of brain scans, but also analysing some of the microbiome and that's from mice who they were trained to be addicted to chocolate pellets.
Sounds like an odd thing to train a mouse to do.
Yeah, but chocolate's addictive.
And it's for science. Sounds like they were doing something similar to what we found in the cow gut microbiome study, where they basically analysed the entire genetics of what's going on in there. and then correlate that with different types of bacteria or whatever may be in there,
Yeah.
and seem to find this really clear correlation between certain populations of bacteria and behaviour of either mice or people.
I would also point out that at least in one of the studies, they only did the study on male mice and humans.
No, didn't they explain why though?
No, but I mean, that's a lot of science and medicine. It's just only men.
That does seem a little bit odd in choosing them without justifying it.
No.
Because you'd think you'd want the diversity of the population in there to prove it's not just a specific part of the population.
Oh, wait. No, wait. Sorry. It's only male mice, but they considered both male and female humans, but only male mice. Don't know why.
Oh, well, maybe they had their scientific justification that's obvious to people that work in that field, but not to people like us who have just come across this thing and thought, wow, that's interesting, I want to learn more.
Yep.
Yeah. I was getting quite happily distracted by some of the different methods they were using, and how can you tell if a human feels like they're more addicted to food based on just thoughts. And they essentially, for the humans, I think it was quite hard because they used like this Yale food addiction scale, which is like 25 questions that you have to answer. And I think they did take samples from the guts of the humans as well to make sure that they'd actually got the right bacteria there. But for the mice, they had a bit more of a, training scheme and testing scheme. So I was trying to intrigue that even though they use these different metrics, they were in agreement as well, which I think is quite surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not ethical to train a person to be addicted to food. So you just have to go with the next best thing.
Well, I guess they maybe pre-selected some people that had certain eating behaviours already.
Yeah.
But what I found interesting is, so they looked at the gut microbiome and they found this correlation between microbiome and behaviour, and they just went, look, this is proof. And to me, as a hardcore scientist that works in the lab, I'm like, well, what's the communication pathway in that case? That to me sounds like a correlation, not definitive proof of how one thing influences another.
But I think that is something that they're still trying to figure out, because right now they're trying to look at influencing the gut microbiome as a way of treating food addiction, which could help with things like obesity and diet-related ailments. So I think it's more of just like identifying whether or not there could be any connection, and then they'll work on trying to figure out what's the actual pathway. So from what the gut signals to the brain and what the bacteria impacts that, I don't think they're going to figure that out for a while.
No, it's just what interested me, and I thought, well, exactly how does this happen?
I'd be more interested in how they use it to treat food addiction, because I think they identified something in your microbiome that is more prevalent in people who are not food addicted. So potentially, if you could influence the microbiome to be more rich in that kind of bacteria, that could potentially help people with food addiction.
And what I will say, to go back on my whole, what is the actual mechanism and why aren't they telling me? I got the impression from what this research group does that their specialism is looking at gene expression in different parts of an organism or a system, because some of their previous studies, they were looking at gene expression in certain parts of the brain and figuring out that there were some dopamine receptors that were being expressed in the medial prefrontal cortex, I think they said. And that was also linked to having sort of addictive qualities in that person or addictive behaviours. So it's like they're tracing all these different aspects of where can addiction be modified using genetics and how can we influence that?
Yeah, I think I read the same thing on like actually the focus on the brain and the specific like addictive part on the brain, and then them trying to control that to see the effects. But I feel like, I mean, maybe this is me not as a biologist, that the brain is just so complex and there's so many different interrelationships that if you do suppress one specific part, then how do you know something else isn't compensating for it? Like, I feel like there's just so many variables that it would be really hard to even track any changes that you made.
I have immense respect for all biologists that do this sort of stuff, because it just sounds so challenging to pin down just one variable. I mean, Emma, you're a physicist and I've worked in a lab a lot. Jasmin, you're an engineer, so we're used to being able to control certain variables and seeing what the effect is.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I work in the lab. I work in vitro, which basically just means like not in cells. So I just look purely at DNA. So my work feels very cause and effect. Whereas if I was to do the same experiment inside a cell, I can imagine it would be so different because there's so many different things happening. So I'm very glad I work on in vitro things. I think that's probably why the argument's heavy on how they're actually doing these methods and what they're seeing from what they've done, rather than a general, oh, and this then means this is what's happening here.
I feel like we're delving into just how different disciplines work, I guess. And we started off talking about this gut-brain connection, which, as I say, I feel like it's not very well understood. So this study has found a cause and an effect. And I still find it just weird that gut bacteria can influence your behaviour. It's like you're not really in control of your body. I feel like that's what this study is saying to me. You're controlled by what goes on in your guts.
On like a dry mass basis, isn't the human body, more terms of dry mass bacteria than actual human?
Ooh, I have never thought about it like that.
At least that was something I heard. I don't know if it's true. I just assumed it was. Because the human body is like mostly water.
I would like to think it's protein or bone. Something else to look into. Maybe that's a separate episode.
Are we human or are we just bacteria in our guts?
Jasmine, you were talking about how they were using this study to figure out how they could influence food addiction by supplying probiotics. I can imagine that at some point in the past people thought that was an absolutely crazy idea, because how would feeding someone something that doesn't, I guess in itself isn't particularly addictive or doesn't have any sort of medicinal purposes, how would that make a difference?
But for like some other kind of ailments, eating probiotics or prebiotics is a prescribed way of medicating. Because if you can promote a healthier gut microbiome, it does help with overall general health, especially with anything that's related to digestion. But yeah, I think the evidence is yet to be seen on whether or not if you feed someone some probiotics or was it called a fecal
transplant? Oh, it sounds a bit grim.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see whether or not they do any like trials for food addiction with this. And I'm interested to see what the results would be.
It's a different way of modifying your gut microbiome, isn't it? By taking the microbiome from someone else and transplanting it. Doesn't sound pleasant.
Because I think your gut microbiome might also have an impact on certain like food allergies, or maybe not allergies or sensitivities.
Mm.
Yeah, and this is because the bacteria and the yeast and the viruses in your gut can help break down food and produce different products of it. Like I think we mentioned volatile fatty acids in the cow episode.
Mm.
And then your body can use those in different ways.
I read a similar thing that different bacteria in your gut can also work together and actually like synthesize vitamins. Like vitamin B12 is largely synthesized by some of your gut bacteria. And so I imagine if you have like a very diverse gut bacteria, I don't want to say family because that's definitely not right, but like community, then you may like end up feeling more awake and having these kind of benefits of having high levels of B12, but actually not know that in yourself. And then I feel like it's so hard for a person to be able to track changes of be like, okay, if I take my Yakult every day, will I then feel more awake? Or did I just get better sleep? You know, I think it's very hard for us as like everyday people to actually act on a lot of the research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, it could just be a placebo.
Just because you're taking this yogurt, this Yakult that's meant to be good for you, so you feel better as a result. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there have been a few clinical studies that have been quite thorough about how they've gone about giving people either probiotics or not. And it's been like this completely blind study, so you don't know what you're getting. And a lot of studies did report, maybe not necessarily food addiction, but like people were less depressed or less anxious. So there does seem to be some science behind it, but I'm still not sure I'd just be buying something off the shelf and eating it to improve my mood.
One of the arguments against using prebiotics and probiotics, especially like the yogurts, is that the bacteria that you want probably won't make it past the stomach because it'll just get destroyed by the stomach acid.
Yeah, hence why there's a bit of a trend of DIY fecal implants, which I just a terrible idea.
I'd never heard of those as well. Like, I literally am in complete shock right now, and I'm scared to Google and research more.
Oh yeah, no, don't.
But I would still like, being a hardcore scientist, someone to explain all the different ways that the gut and the brain communicate. Because there's something called the enteric nervous system So it's basically like nerves connecting your gut to your brain. So that's one way it can communicate. But you can also have hormones, and your immune system can play a part. And I can kind of see how your immune system would feature, because we're talking about bacteria in your body. And your body would normally attack bacteria if it's not meant to be there. Which then got me wondering about, when you get a stomach bug and you start feeling a bit sick and then you throw up, what exactly is going on in your body to make that happen? Because I've never really thought about it. I've just been ill and moved on.
And also, I was reading a lot when I was reading about this, that when you get like nervous for something and you start to feel a little bit sick, how that is something that actually physically happens, because it's literally happened to me so many times, and I actually don't understand how when I feel stressed or scared for something, I start to feel physically ill. And like people were saying that's one of the major like gut health anxiety relationships, is that it has a massive effect of you being able to actually physically feel you being stressed, which I thought was crazy. And I still can't understand it.
No, and then, so let's assume that your gut bacteria are playing a part there. If you start to feel stressed, does that then affect how the gut bacteria will operate? Like, will some of them just stop producing certain chemicals? Or do they just carry on doing their own independent thing? And you've got just your own body's physical effect. So your neurons are firing and making your gut contract or something, and that's as far as it goes.
But even when you say it like that, it does sound like something that's so impossible to know. Because how can you track the motions of like individual cells, basically? It's a tough job for the microbiologists.
Yeah, and I assume it has to be quite an interdisciplinary team. So the news story I read that started off this conversation, they tend to look at gene expression, and that's just one part of what a body does. But I guess there are like cell biologists and people that specialize in like looking at what hormones do.
Yeah, and even like just the different, like you have to get people who are experts in different types of testing as well. And that could be all biologists, but completely different fields of study, and hugely bringing them together and communicating between them is definitely also a huge task, as I've learned in my PhD.
Yeah, and then even just analysing all the data as well. If you've got all this gene expression data, I think one of the studies mentioned they do something called principal component regression, which I remember doing in my master's, which is basically like an AI algorithm essentially that figures out patterns. And you couldn't really do that yourself. You have to get a computer to do it for you, but you have to know the technique to apply it and apply it properly, which I couldn't do anymore. It's been far too long.
In addition to like biologists, but maybe also people who work in the medical field would also be valuable contributors to this kind of research, because in addition to studying the actual bacteria in the guts, they also use brain scans because they wanted to study how the brain reacted in the addicted versus non-addicted mice. The way that they try to like link the brain scans is similar to other kind of addictions, so things like drugs and alcohol, and just like how the brain reacts. It really triggers the reward part of your brain.
That is a good point. This sounds a bit mad, but could there possibly be a link between your gut bacteria populations and whether you have like gambling addiction, say, which has got nothing to do with what you're consuming, but is still an addictive behaviour?
If they can figure out how your gut bacteria talks to your brain and makes you addicted to food, they may be able to use it to treat other kinds of addictions.
Maybe. I still think, having come up with this stupid idea, it's probably a little bit of a stretch.
I mean, they do say in some of the papers, like, treat different things besides food addiction, so
I mean, that would be very cool, but also I'm going to go back to my first point, which was I would believe it.
I mean, maybe if they figure out what the pathway is, they can figure out a way to treat my addiction to just scrolling through my phone mindlessly.
give you a probiotic for that.
I would love that. Yes, please.
I'll have one too.
I was like, we're going down the route of there's basically a pill you could take for any sort of behaviour.
Yes.
We can all become controlled by, oh dear, this is turning into conspiracy theories, what people put in our water.
But it's fine because it's a bacteria pill.
Yeah.
It's a healthy bacteria pill.
And it's just promoting certain types of bacteria in your gut so that it is healthier, so you do less dangerous behaviour.
Perfectly natural. That's fine. All natural
Yes.
things are fine, like arsenic. It's only poisonous in large enough quantities.
Yeah. It's naturally occurring, it's fine.
Oh dear, we've gone down some very weird dystopian future route here. Just ignore the last 2 minutes of what we said, everyone.
Yeah.
Given that we've gone down this weird dystopian route, I feel like that's probably a good place to leave it. We're not talking about actual science fact now, we're just talking about mad speculation that probably isn't real. So, having started off with looking at a study on mice and people that looked at brain activity and some gene expression and the gut microbiome, that found that behaviours and addiction can be influenced by the microorganisms that live in our gut, We've then moved on to talk about some really mad stuff and looked at how it could lead to new ways to help people with addictions. And it's really made us wonder about what is really going on in our bodies, because we're starting to realise that we understand very little. That gives us a lot of scope for future episodes, I think.
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, so we'll get our thinking caps on for what exactly we might want to know for future episodes. But until then, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.